The sun had barely risen over the hills of Milford, Virginia, but the steady clang of the diner's kitchen bell had already become the morning's metronome. Iris Lockhart stood behind the counter of the Griddle Spoon, her dark hair twisted into a lazy bun, an old pencil stuck through it like an afterthought. She wore a denim shirt rolled at the sleeves, frayed at the collar, and a pair of tired black sneakers that had outlived their worth 3 summers ago. She didn't care. There were no fashion judges in Milford. Only truckers, farmers, and retirees who liked their eggs over easy and their gossip even easier. She moved with the instinctive rhythm of someone who had worked the same shifts for far too long, refilling mugs with burnt coffee and dodging the heavy-hipped line cook, Louis, who whistled Sinatra under his breath and always added too much salt to everything. Iris didn't hate her job, but she didn't love it either. It was survival, routine, steady, and entirely unremarkable. The most dramatic thing to happen in the past month was when a raccoon got into the dry storage and ate half a shipment of blueberry muffins. She wiped down a booth that still smelled like cigarette smoke from someone's grandfather and barely noticed when the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new customer. She was mid-swipe when she heard the change. The hush. The way conversations paused mid-word. The way forks clinked louder than usual. That's when she looked up. He didn't look like he belonged. Not in a condescending, obvious way, but in the sense that someone had peeled him out of a lifestyle completely incompatible with everything in this place. He wore a slate gray suit that looked tailored to a precision Iris couldn't afford to think about, a black wool coat folded neatly over his arm, and a silver watch that likely cost more than her entire year of wages. His hair was dark, neat, with just enough wave to suggest a natural, careful disorder. His eyes, icy, alert, impossible to read, swept the room like a silent inventory. Not judgmental, calculated. He chose the booth in the corner, the one closest to the window, farthest from everyone else. As Iris walked toward him, pen and notepad in hand, she heard more than one whispered theory ripple across the diner. Corporate investor, politician, divorced sugar daddy looking to settle down with a waitress. All wrong, but all delicious to the local imagination. He didn't open a menu, didn't ask for recommendations. When she arrived at his table, he simply said, "Black coffee. Hot." His voice was low, steady, like it had been trained to carry weight without volume. Iris gave a polite nod and turned, resisting the urge to look back. Something about him put her on edge. Not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made her spine stiffen and her pulse tick faster. When she brought him the coffee, he thanked her with the kind of nod that meant nothing and everything at once. Detached but aware, present but uninterested. He stayed for over an hour. He didn't eat, didn't scroll through a phone. He just sat there, sometimes watching people, sometimes staring through the window at the gray stretch of road beyond. A man that stillness didn't sit on naturally, a man who was forcing himself to stop. When he finally stood and walked to the counter to pay, Iris couldn't help herself. "Back in town for business?" she asked, trying to mask the curiosity in her tone with casual disinterest. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "No," he said. "I'm here to remember something I forgot, or maybe forget something I never needed." Then he placed 2 crisp $100 bills on the counter, far more than the price of one black coffee, and walked out without waiting for change. She stared after him through the window, watching him disappear into a sleek black car that didn't belong on a road with potholes and roadside deer. The money sat on the counter like a dare. She picked it up, walked to the tip jar, and dropped in exactly $5. The rest went into the register. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing with complete certainty. He wasn't done with Milford. And somehow he wasn't done with her either. It had been 3 days since the man in the slate gray suit had walked into the Griddle Spoon and left behind $5 in the tip jar and a question in Iris's chest that refused to quiet down. She hadn't seen him since, and yet somehow it felt like he hadn't really left. The booth he'd chosen remained empty, even when regulars came in and asked to sit there. She always found a way to guide them elsewhere. She didn't have an explanation for it. She didn't want one. It was late morning when she saw him again. The sky was low and overcast, heavy with rain that had yet to fall, and the air smelled like wet pavement and pine needles. Iris had just finished pouring fresh coffee for a pair of highway workers when she caught the glimpse of that same black car pulling into the lot. It was impossible to mistake. No one else in town drove anything so sleek, so clean, so deliberately out of place. She wiped her hands on a rag and moved toward the counter with practiced indifference. But her pulse had already betrayed her, ticking faster with each step. He entered like the first time, silent, calm, as if the diner's noise and clutter didn't touch him. He wore a navy coat this time, collar turned up against the wind, and a charcoal scarf that looked hand-woven. He didn't glance around. His eyes went straight to her. "Miss Lockhart," he said, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She paused at the sound of her name. He hadn't asked it before. She hadn't told him. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, arms crossing over her apron. "I asked," he said simply, sliding into the same booth. "People talk. You'd be surprised how quickly they give you everything when you offer to fund repairs on the high school roof." Iris narrowed her eyes. "Buying information. Classy. I prefer calling it strategic philanthropy." She stared at him for a beat longer, then reached for her notepad. "Let me guess. Black coffee. Hot." "Exactly," he said. "Though I might be feeling reckless enough for eggs today." When she returned with his coffee, she set it down a little too firmly, spilling a few drops onto the table. He didn't flinch. Instead, he watched her with a kind of focused amusement that bordered on disarming. "What exactly brings a man like you back to a nowhere town like this?" she asked finally. "You're not here for the pancakes, and you're definitely not here for the company." He leaned back in the booth, eyes flickering toward the window, then back to her. "You ever find yourself stuck in a place that feels safer than it should? Like the noise in your head dulls just enough to breathe?" "I don't have time for that kind of thinking," she replied. He smiled, slow and dry. "That's a shame. You strike me as someone who used to dream in big shapes." His words hit something she hadn't protected properly, and she didn't appreciate how accurate they felt. She stepped back slightly, needing the space. "You still haven't told me your name?" He nodded as if that was fair. "Hollis Dane." It meant nothing to her at first, just a name. But then slowly, the context trickled in. The news articles she'd glanced at on the diner's backroom TV, the business headlines, Dane and Kepler Holdings, construction and development, skyscrapers and legal battles, billion-dollar contracts. His face wasn't familiar, but his name was, at least in circles far, far from Milford. "You're that Dane," she said, voice lower now. "Unfortunately," he replied, "though I tend to leave that part out around here. Too many people eager to talk about zoning laws." "So what are you doing here, Hollis Dane?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Trying to remember how to talk to someone who doesn't want anything from me?" Iris didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. She walked away instead, pretending to busy herself at the soda machine, but her hands trembled slightly as she filled a glass with water. She didn't get rattled easily. She dealt with drunken truckers, rude tourists, and men who didn't know when no meant no. But Hollis Dane was a different kind of disruption. He wasn't loud. He wasn't obvious. He was precise. Every word, every pause, every look had weight, as if designed to shift the ground just slightly under your feet. By the time she returned with his eggs, the booth had gone quiet again, tension hovering between them like a held breath. He accepted the plate with a thank you and didn't look up for several long moments. When he finally did, his voice was softer. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Probably not," she said, but sat across from him anyway, breaking her own rule. "What did you want to be?" he asked. "Before life got in the way?" She blinked. No one had asked her that in years, maybe ever. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe a teacher, or a travel photographer. Something with windows, something that let me see the world. But dreams are expensive, and mine weren't on sale." He nodded, and for a moment, she saw something shift behind his expression, like her honesty had touched something in him that wasn't used to being touched. They didn't speak much after that. She refilled his coffee. He left another generous tip, but this time, before leaving, he placed a small slip of paper on the table. It was a quote, just a handwritten line. "Sometimes the smallest towns hold the loudest echoes." She watched him walk out again. And for the first time in years, Iris Lockhart wondered what might happen if she listened closely. By the time the third week rolled around, Hollis Dane had become a quiet sort of rhythm in Iris's life. He came in every other morning, always at the same time, always in a coat that looked like it had its own story, always alone. He never brought a phone to the table, never took meetings. He would sit, drink his coffee, sometimes eat eggs or toast, sometimes nothing, and watch the street outside as if waiting for it to change. Iris never admitted, not even to herself, that she started looking forward to those mornings. But she did. It wasn't just his presence that intrigued her. It was the tension, the weight he carried in silence, the way he watched everything like a man used to solving problems he couldn't speak about. Some days he was conversational. On others, he said almost nothing. But he always left something behind. An observation, a compliment, a line of thought he knew she would chew on the rest of the day. On the 22nd morning, it rained. Not the gentle kind, but the cold, aggressive downpour that made the whole town smell like wet pavement and pine sap. The diner was half empty, mostly regulars trying to kill time before going back out into the mess. Iris was behind the counter drying glasses when the bell chimed. Hollis entered without a coat this time, his dark hair damp and clinging to his forehead, suit jacket spotted with rain. He looked like he'd walked 10 blocks through a storm with no umbrella and no concern for it. She walked over to his booth, eyebrow raised. "You're a billionaire, and you don't own an umbrella?" He didn't smile, but there was something like amusement behind his eyes. "I own several. I just didn't want one today." She set a mug down and filled it. "Existential protest?" "Something like that. Sounds exhausting." He met her gaze. "It is." She lingered a second too long, then turned away before her thoughts turned traitorous. She told herself it was just small-town boredom, the novelty of a man like him in a place like this. But deep down, she knew it was more. There was something unspoken hanging between them. Never acknowledged, never acted on, but undeniably present. It wasn't flirting, not exactly. It was heavier, more intimate than anything that had been said aloud. She returned to the counter but kept her eyes on him from the corner of her vision. He was staring out the window, the muscles in his jaw tight. Something was wrong. She could see it in the way he held his shoulders, the way he didn't touch his coffee. After a while, he reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a thin envelope. He opened it, unfolded a letter, read it once, then again. Whatever it said, it hardened his face into something unreadable. A moment later, he stood up and walked straight to the counter. She met him halfway. "I need you to tell me the worst thing you've ever done," he said. No preamble, no softness. Just that. Iris blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." "You said once you don't have time for thinking. Today I think you should make time. What's the worst thing you've ever done?" She stared at him, her hands flat on the counter. "Why? So you can judge me?" "No," he said. "So I can see if you'll answer." She laughed, sharp and unamused. "You don't get to walk in here with rain on your face and demand that kind of intimacy." "Then make it a trade," he said. "You tell me yours. I'll tell you mine." The challenge lingered in the air. She hated the way her pulse responded to it, hated that part of her wanted to lean forward and whisper something real. But pride got there first. "You go first," she said. He held her gaze for several seconds. Then he nodded once, slowly. "I married someone I didn't love," he said, "because my board wanted stability, and I was too much of a coward to admit I didn't know what love was. I let her get hurt because I didn't care enough to stop it. And I stayed until she left, humiliated and angry. And I did nothing." His voice didn't tremble. His face didn't move. But something in it cracked. Iris felt it like a wave of cold air across her skin. She hadn't expected him to actually answer. She certainly hadn't expected that answer. She swallowed. "I left my sister alone," she said quietly. "I was 17. She was 12. I was supposed to pick her up from her piano lesson, but I was with a boy I thought mattered more. She walked home alone, in the dark. Nothing happened, but she cried. For hours, and she never let me forget it." They stood there in silence. Two strangers with open wounds between them. Neither tried to say it was okay. Neither pretended to be absolved. That was what made it honest. Then he said something unexpected. "You're braver than I am," she scoffed. "Hardly." "You are," he said. "You admitted to something you still live with. I only ever admit things once they stop being able to touch me." Something tightened in her throat. She hated how well he saw her, hated that he let himself be seen in return. "You should leave before I slap you," she muttered, suddenly overwhelmed. stepping back from the counter. His eyes sparked. Why? Because I don't know what to do with this, she snapped. With you, with this, whatever it is we're doing. He stepped forward, close enough that she felt the heat of him, smelled rain and something expensive. And neither do I. And then before she could think, before she could retreat or react, his hand touched her cheek, fingertips light but certain, and he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't violent. It was deliberate, full of all the tension they'd been holding like breath. His lips met hers with a pressure that asked, not demanded, and she answered. For a few seconds, time disappeared. There was only the kiss, and the fact that it felt like a door had finally opened inside both of them. Then she broke away. Not gently. She slapped him. A sharp, echoing crack of palm against jaw. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at her, breathing hard. Are you done, Hakonai? He asked. Not even close, she said. And then she turned and walked into the back, heart pounding like a drum. The letter arrived 2 days after the slap. Iris had almost convinced herself that what had happened between her and Hollis hadn't been real. Maybe it had been a moment of misread signals. Maybe she'd imagined the intensity in his eyes, or the way her body had leaned into the kiss before her brain caught up and retaliated. She told herself it had been a mistake, a fluke of hormones and misplaced emotion, and she did what she always did with discomfort. She buried it beneath a hard shell of sarcasm and work. She scrubbed counters more than necessary. She kept conversations short, and she didn't check the corner booth to see if he'd come back. She was off work that morning when the mail arrived. The day was still gray. The sky hung low like it might break open at any second. Iris's mother was resting, her breath wheezing softly in the next room, and Iris was folding laundry on the couch when she noticed the envelope. It had no return address, but the quality of the paper was too nice to be from the gas company, and her name was written in small, elegant script. Inside was a formal note, typed on a thick cardstock that smelled faintly of cedar and something more expensive she couldn't name. Iris, I'm extending an offer. My mother, Eleanor Dane, is recovering from a recent stroke and requires temporary in-home assistance, companionship, simple errands, conversation. I believe you'd be uniquely suited to the position. The contract is for 1 month, fully compensated at a rate that I'm certain will seem unreasonable to you. It's not charity, it's a challenge. If you're interested, the car will be at your door this Friday at 9 a.m. HD. There was no signature, no apology, no mention of what had happened in the diner. Just this offer, bold and cryptic, like everything else about him. Iris reread it twice, then threw it across the room. It landed face down on the coffee table, smug and silent. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat on the floor beside her mother's bed, listening to the low buzz of the oxygen machine and the gentle click of the clock on the wall. Money like that could cover her mother's medication for a year. It could fix the roof. It could buy her time, the one thing she never seemed to have enough of. But it wasn't the money that made her fingers twitch. It was the thought of being in his space again, on his terms. When Friday came, she was up before the sun. She paced for hours, telling herself she wouldn't go, that she was better than this, that she wouldn't let him turn their tension into some kind of rich man puzzle. At 8:58 a.m., she was still in her pajamas. At 9:01 sharp, the car pulled into the gravel driveway. Black, polished, silent. By 9:07, she was dressed, packed, and locking the front door. The ride to Charleston took 4 hours, most of it through winding back roads that cut through fields and small towns she'd never visited. The driver didn't speak unless she did, and even then, only in short, clipped replies. The silence gave her too much time to think. She remembered the way Hollis had looked at her after the slap, more curious than angry, more alive than he had the entire time she'd known him. She didn't understand him, but that didn't stop her from thinking about him. When they pulled up to the house, Iris's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a house. It was a mansion, hidden behind wrought iron gates and tall magnolia trees. The kind of place that looked too pristine to touch. Brick pathways wound through manicured gardens, and a grand porch wrapped around the front like an open-armed invitation. The front door opened before she could knock. A woman in her 60s stood there, elegant even in a wheelchair, with silver hair swept into a low chignon and sharp eyes that held mischief and intelligence in equal measure. You must be Iris, she said, smiling, as if they were already old friends. I'm Eleanor. Don't let the wheels fool you. I'm only halfway useless. Iris smiled despite herself. It's nice to meet you. Come in. Let's get the awkward part out of the way quickly. I know you're here because my son wrote you some dramatic letter, and I apologize in advance for his tendency to be cryptic. He gets that from his father. That and the brooding. Eleanor's home was full of warmth, soft lighting, bookcases packed to overflowing, the smell of fresh flowers in every room. Despite the grandeur, it didn't feel cold. It felt lived in, comfortable. Over the next 2 days, Iris settled into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Eleanor was witty, curious, and sharp as glass. She asked about Iris's life, her mother, her work, and told stories about raising Hollis that made Iris laugh until she nearly cried. But the one person who stayed on the edge of every room, every thought, was Hollis himself. He didn't appear. Not even once. She asked Eleanor about him only once, and Eleanor had waved it off. He's around, watching, I imagine. He does that when he's unsure what to say. By the third night, Iris was standing on the second-floor balcony when she saw him walking the path through the back gardens, hands in his coat pockets, head bent slightly as if he was thinking hard enough to make the ground shift. She didn't call to him, but the moment he looked up and met her eyes, her heart betrayed her and jumped once in her chest. And in that quiet second, she knew exactly what she had agreed to. She hadn't accepted a job. She had stepped into a game. It was Eleanor who made it impossible for Iris to keep pretending that Hollis's absence didn't gnaw at her. On the morning of the fifth day, over tea and toast in the sunroom, Eleanor peered at Iris over the rim of her delicate porcelain cup and said as casually as if they were discussing the weather, "He's doing that thing again, pulling away when he feels too much." Iris looked up from her breakfast. "You mean hiding?" Potato, Eleanor said, waving one hand. "When Hollis was 7, he got bit by a dog. I asked him if it hurt, and he said no, while his knee was bleeding through his jeans. That's who he's always been. He swallows pain until it turns into silence. He doesn't mean to push people away. He just thinks that by disappearing, he's protecting them." Iris didn't know how to respond. Eleanor had a way of dropping truth bombs in the middle of otherwise ordinary conversations, leaving Iris to sort through the emotional debris afterward. She sat back in her chair and stared through the wide glass windows that overlooked the back gardens. She'd come to like that view, the way the ivy crept up the stone walls, the small fountain that bubbled in the corner. It was a place that looked like peace even if the people inside it were anything but. She hadn't seen Hollis since that brief moment in the garden when their eyes met. After that, nothing. No notes, no awkward conversations. Not even a passing glimpse. It was like he'd built himself into the house, present in the details but absent from the living, and that irritated her more than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, she wandered into the library to shelve a book Eleanor had finished. The room was massive, with towering shelves and tall windows draped in velvet. It smelled of cedar, dust, and ink. She found herself running her fingers along the spines, tracing titles she'd never heard of, wondering if Hollis had read them all. She was halfway across the room when she turned a corner and nearly collided with him. He stood in front of one of the windows, bathed in late afternoon light, one hand resting on the sill. He wore a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, the most relaxed she'd seen him. But there was still something tense in the line of his shoulders, something that warned her this version of him was no less guarded than the one in the suit. "I didn't think you'd be here," she said, voice more brittle than she intended. "I live here," he said, not turning around. "You've got a funny way of showing it." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. She should have left it there, but she didn't. "I didn't come here to play housemaid to your avoidance issues, Hollis." That got his attention. He turned slowly, and there was something in his eyes that looked equal parts surprise and restraint. "I thought you came for the money," he said quietly. "I did, at first." She walked toward him, one hand still on the back of a leather chair. "But then I met your mother, and then I remembered the way you looked at me in the diner. And then I remembered how you kissed me and walked away like none of it meant anything." His jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "I'm not here for games," she continued. "I get that I'm not your type. I'm not polished or docile or impressed by the way you talk around things. But I'm not a coward either. And if you brought me here to push me away, you should have sent the car somewhere else." She was shaking slightly now, but it wasn't from fear. It was anger, frustration, honesty scraping against her insides. He stared at her for a long moment, and then, without a word, he crossed the distance between them. His hand reached out, hesitated, then settled lightly against her face. It wasn't like the last kiss. There was no fire, no heat behind desperation. There was only quiet intensity, a slow press of lips to lips that asked instead of demanded. It felt like a question he didn't know how to phrase out loud. When they parted, she didn't step back. "You don't get to disappear again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not trying to disappear," he said. "I'm trying to survive you." That should have made her angry, but it didn't, because she understood it. She felt the same way. They stood like that for a long moment, something fragile and unnamed stretching between them. Then he let go, stepped back, and ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't simple for me, Iris," he said. "I don't do well with closeness." "I'm not asking you to do well," she said. "I'm asking you not to lie to me about what this is." His gaze softened. "It's something." "Then let it be something." He nodded, and the wall between them didn't collapse, but it cracked. Later that night, they ended up in the kitchen, sitting on opposite sides of the island, sharing leftover wine and talking about nothing important. She learned that he hated olives, that he once got kicked out of boarding school for dismantling a car engine in the science lab, and that he didn't believe in fate, only timing. She told him about her mother's resilience, about her first heartbreak, about the way she used to draw cities she'd never seen. By the time she went to bed, Iris knew one thing for certain: he was letting her in. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. And that terrified her in a way no kiss ever could. It was past midnight when Iris woke to the soft sound of rain tapping against the window pane. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of old pipes settling, and for a moment she wasn't sure what had woken her. Then she heard it again, light footsteps in the hallway, measured and purposeful, moving past her door. Something about the sound tugged at her instincts. She got up, pulled on a sweater, and stepped barefoot into the corridor, the old wooden floors cool beneath her feet. The house, usually grand and welcoming, now felt cavernous in the dark. She followed the sound until she reached the staircase, where faint light from the lower floor flickered like candlelight. As she descended, the smell of smoke, clean and expensive, like cedar and clove, drifted toward her. It wasn't fire. It was cigars. She turned the corner and found Hollis in the study, seated in a leather armchair beside the fireplace, which crackled low and warm. He was alone, dressed in a dark t-shirt and trousers, his profile sharp in the glow. A half-drained glass of something amber rested in his hand, and an untouched cigar burned slowly in the ashtray beside him. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he looked like he'd been waiting. "You're up," he said quietly, not moving. "So are you," she replied, stepping into the room and gently closing the door behind her. He gestured to the second chair across from him. "Couldn't sleep?" "Not really." She sat down but didn't lean back. "You?" He glanced into the fire. "Sometimes sleep feels like surrender. I'm not ready for that tonight." They sat in silence for a moment, the crackle of wood and the occasional thunder outside filling the space between their words. "I keep thinking," he said after a while, "how strange it is to feel something at the wrong time. How inconvenient it is to care when your life has already been built to function without softness." She watched him carefully. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying I never expected you," he answered, "and I don't know how to fit you into the version of myself I've spent years perfecting." She leaned forward slightly, arms resting on her knees. "Then maybe it's time to stop trying to be perfect." He met her gaze then, and for the first time she saw something raw. Vulnerability not crafted or restrained. Just there, plain and human. "There's something you don't know," he said, his voice lower now. "Something I should have told you before I brought you here." She didn't speak. She waited. "I'm sick," he said. "Not dying, not yet, but close enough that my doctors keep saying things like statistical anomalies and experimental trials. I have a tumor. It's inoperable for now, but there's a sliver of hope if I play it exactly right." The words hit her with the weight of cold water. She blinked once, then twice. Her first instinct was disbelief, followed by a rush of clarity that explained everything. His silence, his distance, the sharpness in his eyes when he looked at her, like he was memorizing something he couldn't keep. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. 8 months, and he said. "And before you ask, yes, that's why I came here. To this town, to that diner. I thought I was coming to say goodbye to everything I used to want. But then you slapped me." He laughed softly, but it was hollow. "And you made me want something again." Iris didn't cry. Not yet. The tears hadn't caught up to her understanding. She sat back slowly, processing the information, feeling her own heart recalibrate. Everything made sense now. Every withdrawal, every unanswered question, every time he looked at her like she was both a beginning and an end. "You should have told me," she said. "I didn't want to trap you in it. I didn't want pity." "Do I seem like someone who pities?" "No," he admitted. "You seem like someone who fights." She stood up then, walked around the table and sat on the arm of his chair. He didn't move. She reached out and took his hand, the one that held the glass, and guided it to the table. Then she looked down at him, at the man who had spent so long building walls only to let her sneak through a crack. "I don't care how long you have," she said. "I'm not here for a timeline. I'm here for you." His eyes flickered with something like panic, raw and stunned and real. "You don't mean that?" She leaned down, pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "I do, and I'm allowed to mean it. You don't get to decide how much of this I can take." The firelight danced across his face, and when he kissed her, it wasn't controlled or rehearsed. It was the kind of kiss that came from a man who had nothing to offer but everything to give. She kissed him back with the kind of honesty that burned down fear. That night they didn't sleep. They talked. They lay in silence. They breathed the same air. And for the first time, neither of them ran. For the first time, they let themselves just be. The days that followed unfolded with a strange kind of beauty. The kind that could only exist when two people allowed themselves to stop pretending. After that night in the study, Iris no longer tiptoed around her feelings, and Hollis no longer hid behind his silences. Their rhythm changed, not suddenly, not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet acts of care. He started joining her and Eleanor for breakfast, lingering over coffee, making dry jokes that surprised them both. She began leaving books outside his door, ones she thought he might like, and he returned them marked with underlined passages and cryptic notes in the margins. It became a language between them, private and unspoken, deeper than flirtation, more intimate than touch. Iris started walking with him in the evenings, sometimes through the gardens, other times along the tree-lined roads just outside the property. The air was cooler now, spring shifting toward early summer, and the scent of earth and magnolia followed them wherever they went. He never held her hand in public, never made their closeness a spectacle, but his eyes never strayed far from her, and that constant awareness created a bond more powerful than anything physical. One night, after Eleanor had gone to bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the back steps, sharing a bottle of wine and listening to crickets sing beneath the stars. Iris leaned her head against Hollis's shoulder, and for the first time he reached up and brushed her hair back, tucking it behind her ear like he'd done it 1,000 times. "I keep thinking about the word temporary," he said softly, staring out at the dark line of trees. "It's always been comforting to me. Temporary contracts, temporary headlines, temporary relationships. They end before they can hurt." "And now?" she asked. "Now I hate the word," he said, "because this, whatever this is, feels anything but temporary." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to look at him, took the wine glass from his hand, and set it down beside her. "Then stop treating it like it is." He looked at her, eyes shadowed and honest. "It's hard to let yourself want something when you're not sure if you'll be here to keep it." "You don't have to promise me forever," she said. "Just promise me now." It was a simple sentence, not dramatic, not poetic, but it held everything she meant, every risk, every hope, every breath of trust she was giving him without a safety net. He reached for her then, pulled her into his arms and held her like he was afraid to let go. They stayed that way for a long time, saying nothing, letting the night wrap around them like a secret only they understood. But peace never lasted in Hollistane's world. The following morning, Iris found Eleanor sitting on the edge of the veranda, her expression tight. There was an envelope in her lap, and she was staring at it like it might bite. "It's from his doctor," Eleanor said when Iris asked. "The scans came in early." Iris's stomach flipped. "Do you know what it says?" "No," Eleanor said, Because I haven't opened it. It's not mine to read, but he won't open it either. He asked me to burn it. Iris blinked. What? He says he doesn't want to know, that he'd rather live these next weeks as if they're his last, just in case. Iris didn't respond, not at first. She picked up the envelope, ran her fingers along the sealed edge, and stared at the name printed in small, professional letters. Hollis Dane. Test results, confidential. Later that day, she found him in the conservatory, reading one of the books she'd given him. Barefoot, sleeves rolled, eyes focused. He looked up when she entered and immediately read her expression. You saw the envelope, he said. I did. And I think you're a coward. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't look offended. I suppose I deserve that. You said you wanted this to be real, she continued, voice rising slightly. But you can't keep building something with me while pretending you don't care what happens next. You can't ask me to be brave and then hide behind denial. Iris, no, she said, cutting him off. You don't get to protect me by choosing ignorance. That's not love. That's fear. And I know a thing or two about fear. I've lived half my life running from it, but not anymore. And if I can show up for this, if I can show up for you, then you damn well can too. He stood then, slowly, setting the book aside. There was no anger in his face, only something quiet and wrecked. I'm terrified, he said, not of dying, but of what it means to keep living, of what I owe people if I stay. You don't owe anyone anything but the truth, she said, but if you don't open that letter, you'll never forgive yourself. And I won't wait in the dark for someone who's too scared to face the light. They stood in the room, two people braver than they wanted to be, staring down a choice that felt bigger than love, bigger than sickness, bigger than either of them alone. Later that evening, the envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter. But when Iris came down in the morning, it was gone. And when she found Hollis sitting on the porch with red eyes and trembling hands, she knew what he had done. He had finally opened it. It was just after sunrise when Iris stepped out onto the porch and found Hollis already there. Sitting in the old rocking chair Eleanor always said creaked louder than the truth. The morning light hadn't yet burned off the haze, and the dew clung to the grass like a secret not yet confessed. Hollis sat still, elbows on knees, a single sheet of paper clutched between his hands, its edges bent, thumb smudged and trembling. He didn't look up when she approached. He didn't need to. She could feel the gravity in the air between them. She sat down beside him, not saying anything at first. The porch was silent, except for the occasional call of a mourning dove and the slow, rhythmic creak of the chair beneath him. She watched him breathe, shallow, uneven, and waited. Not for words, but for readiness. He handed her the paper without looking, and she took it carefully, unfolding it with slow fingers, as though anything faster might make it tear in two. It was a doctor's letter. Clinical, precise, written in that sterile language meant to distance people from their own fate. The words didn't scream, they didn't cry, but they hit like thunder all the same. Tumor stabilized, no signs of growth. Candidates for surgery include, her eyes skimmed faster, margin of success, recommend proceeding, favorable response to prior treatment, encouraged to explore aggressive next steps. When she looked up, tears had already begun slipping down her cheeks. She didn't remember starting to cry. She didn't speak either, just reached out and took his hand, gripping it with all the strength of someone who didn't know whether to sob or laugh. Hollis finally looked at her then, his expression unreadable, like he hadn't dared process it yet. I don't know how to feel, he said softly, the words almost inaudible. I prepared myself for the worst, over and over. I didn't think I'd get to choose hope. Iris turned in her seat to face him fully. Then choose it now. Don't wait for it to ask twice. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes glassy, and then let out a breath that sounded more like release than relief. She pulled him toward her, and he didn't resist. Their foreheads touched, and for a while they just breathed each other in, the paper forgotten on the porch beside them. The next week passed in a blur. Tests, phone calls, scheduling. Eleanor lit up with energy Iris hadn't seen in days. Hollis moved through the house like a man waking from a long winter, cautious but wide-eyed. He was quiet at first, uncertain, like hope might break if he touched it too directly. But as the days passed, he let himself begin again. Not in words, but in motion. He smiled more. He asked questions about things he used to avoid, plans, travel, the future. He asked Iris what kind of dog she'd want. He asked if she'd ever live by the water. And one night, he asked if she believed in starting over, even when the story had already begun. She answered yes to everyone. The night before his surgery, they lay in bed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the stillness. Iris ran her fingers slowly over the line of his jaw, memorizing the quiet strength there. "You're not afraid anymore," she said. "I'm still afraid," he whispered. "But I want more than I fear now. And that's new." "You'll be okay," she said, pressing her hand over his heart. "I've already decided." The next morning, he left for the hospital with Eleanor and a team of specialists he used to keep at arm's length. Iris stayed behind at his request, not because he didn't want her there, but because he knew she'd need the silence of that old house to hold herself together. She waited by the window, cup of untouched coffee in her hands, watching birds flit across the trees, whispering prayers she didn't even realize she still believed in. The call came just before sunset. A nurse with a bright voice said words Iris could barely believe. "He's awake. He's asking for you." It went better than expected. "The doctor says he's going to make it." She dropped the phone and wept, right there on the floor, clutching the hem of her sweater like it could anchor her to the moment. When she finally pulled herself together, she ran to Eleanor's room, and the two of them hugged without words. Later, they lit candles. Not because they were religious, but because the house had never felt more sacred. A week later, Hollis came home. He was thinner, paler, but alive in a way Iris had never seen before. They sat on the porch again, side by side, the same chairs, the same breeze, but everything changed. He turned to her slowly, took something from his coat pocket, and held it out. A simple ring. Gold, no diamonds, no ceremony. "I don't need a long speech," he said. "Just you. And a promise we stop waiting for time to tell us what's worth holding on to." She didn't cry that time. She just said yes. And the creaking chair beside her finally sounded like music.